So as we've been, as an organization, looking at sequester over the last number of months, we've kind of come to the conclusion that some form of sequester is, at least today, likely. So the focus has really shifted now to what companies can do to protect themselves against it and or prepare for it, the two separate things. And that was the focus of the program on July 10th. You and Bill Roberts from Wiley Ryan laid out a whole set of things for companies to be thinking about. We'll be posting the audio and the slides on our website fairly soon. But what, at a high level, what are the key areas companies need to be thinking about?
Well, first is to stay informed. Understand the dynamics of what's taking place in the market. Be attuned to what your customers, the government agencies, are saying. In addition, companies can and should know their contracts. Do a little bit of a deep dive on their current contracts. Know what they are, which are fixed price, which are cost type. Know the life cycle, where they are in the life cycle of those contracts. Are they at the early stage or the more mature stage? Because those decisions are important to not only the company as they evaluate work, but to the agency as it evaluates actions that it might have to take.
Fixed price versus cost type specifically, how do they play differently in a sequester environment in your view?
Well, in a fixed price contract, the risk of a change to that contract, the government may still incur the cost associated with that contract even if they terminate it. And so agencies, when they're looking to save money, might actually not save any money in a cost type in a fixed price contract. Cost type contract, the government has a lot more flexibility to adjust the scope of work, the spend, the timing of the spend, and their liability is a lot less in cost type contracts. This is one of the ironies of the current circumstance when the government has been pushing for more fixed price contracts, yet in a sequestration environment that may be put them in the worst position.
So we've heard from some companies that what they're seeing in fixed price contracts is the government now, in some cases, establishing a flat dollar figure for termination liability versus some percentage or tied to progress or percentage completion if there was a termination for convenience, not default. Do you think we're going to see more government actions to limit their liability because of specifically what you're talking about?
Well, there's no government-wide regulation that gives them that authority, and I would hope that companies would be very loath to accept such a limitation on liability or exposure for their work. It could have significant consequences, not only for them as a company, but for their subcontractors or vendors, and could put performance at risk. But I wouldn't be surprised if the government officials get very creative in trying to address the risk of sequestration or the reality of sequestration down the road with clauses such as a termination liability cap.
Recognizing that there's a million questions, far more questions than answers here, as we look at the first quarter of FY13, you hear two different things. One is we might see an acceleration in spending as agencies try to obligate more dollars, thinking that the more they obligate, the more they can protect those dollars against, at least the technically protected against automatic sequester. Others are saying, no, they're going to behave as if they're in sequester to begin with. We're going to see a slowdown. First quarter is always a relatively modest to slow period anyway. How does that play, those play together? Is there anything in sequester that would drive acceleration or a slowdown, or are we going to see some mix?
Well, I think it's likely to be a mix. Remember, the key terms that we worry about in sequestration are budget resources. Think about that in budget authority. What is the amount that the agency has available to spend? It doesn't go to actual spending. And so in that sense, there is no advantage or disadvantage to the agency to actually committing funds. It looks at the budget resources available to the agency. Two other considerations. As in every appropriations bill enacted, the Office of Management and Budget is going to dole out to the agencies what's called an apportionment, a portion of the funds that the agency can spend. And so there won't be an ability of the agency to do rapid spending or advanced spending until they get the money from OMB. And secondly, agencies are precluded from impounding funds. We talked about in the program the other constraints against slowdown spending that aren't pursuant to a deferral or an impoundment under a very specific set of laws. So again, the agency's flexibility is somewhat bounded on the acceleration side by the amount of funds available from OMB through apportionment, and on the slowdown side by the impoundment regulations. That having been said, planning is very important, and how the agencies plan and execute against that sequestration plan is going to be real important. That's where the confusions continue to lie.
Well, and as we said earlier, that the folks can get much more detail on this from the audio from the program and the slides that we're going to post on the website at pscouncil.org. Last question, though, a continuing resolution. Fairly certain at this point that we're going to have a continuing, one or more. a lot of questions about what legal authorities will prevail on how the continuing resolution is executed. For example, could it go to March with FY12 spending levels? Does it have to reflect sequester in January 2nd if it is enacted now as a continuing resolution versus a new appropriation? Your read on how the CRs, what the rules around the CR might be.
It adds another level of complexity to the debate. Again, the key phrases that we're going to be looking at, budget, resources, budget authority. So the concurrent resolution provides both a level of budget spending for the agencies, but also constraints. No new work typically under a continuing resolution. So the agencies may have less money to start with, but remember the sequestration has two components to it. The numerator, the amount of money that has to be saved, pretty fixed at this point, and then the denominator, the amount of money available to the agency, and that combination gives you a percentage for the across-the-board reductions. So under a CR environment, if the agencies have spending authority through March, for example, then the budget resources available to them will be known come the enactment of that bill, and that's what we'll have to look for sequestration.
So that will be the baseline for a sequestration. In other words, if we're continuing FY12 spending in essence, or with some modification, that from there is where you have to take the roughly $50 billion for civilians, $50 billion for defense.
That's right.
Not against an FY13 number or any because the cap does change in 13.
Because the cap changes and the amount to be reduced is fixed, but we're looking at available budget resources, the budget authority, and that will come from the appropriations bill.
So you only get the authority if there's an appropriation,
right.
Continuing resolution.
Now there's some backup in the law, fall back to the president's budget if the appropriations law does not go into the account level or the program, project, or activity level. We'll stay on top of that. We'll keep our members informed of what's going on. I can see another sequestration program in our future when we know more clearly whether we're going to have regular appropriations, continuing resolution. I'll just throw in one more caveat that you didn't ask about, debt ceiling. We've done programs on that, and it's important for members to understand that there are real differences between what actions agencies can take under a continuing resolution, under appropriation, or on a debt ceiling. We've talked about that in the past, but I'm sure we'll address it again. But there's another set of issues that will all impinge on the ultimate amount of authority the agencies have to spend.